China has identified the cause of the mysterious new virus.
Coronavirus.
There are fears a rapidly spreading virus has reached Australia.
We now have a name for the disease, COVID-19.
I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
We're asking everyone to work at home if possible, postpone unnecessary travel.
In 2020, a deadly virus spread from China and gripped the whole planet. No country was spared the challenges that this disease presented. Ordinary citizens were forced to remain shut away in their homes, unable to see loved ones or even to say final goodbyes properly.
Really hard. We're not allowed to be together as a family. We're not allowed to say our goodbyes properly.
However, for a certain group of people, the pandemic presented an outstanding opportunity. And this is the story of how British politicians and businesses sought to use the tragedy of a global pandemic for profit, all the while imposing the strictest measures on their own citizens. In order to understand how this corruption was allowed to take place, you first need to understand procurement. Typically, whenever the government or an associated body needs to buy something, it's put out to tender. And what that means is specifications are set for exactly what's needed, the amount of it that's needed, and how much the government is willing to pay. From there, various firms can place competitive bids to fill the government contracts. Officials will then review the bids and they will decide which company will fulfill the order. This competitive process is in place to ensure that the taxpayer gets decent value for their money and that all consideration for contracts is fair. Take this example found on the website BidStats. It shows a procurement order for riot shields by Police Scotland. It's a pretty simple system for governments and bodies of the state to procure goods from private companies. However, in times of emergency, this competitive process can be abandoned. The downsides are clear. There is less oversight, there are fewer choices, and there's no guarantee that the taxpayer will get maximum value for their money. But there are also clear advantages. Items can be procured much faster, and often in the case of an emergency, that's what's required. For example, when British soldiers are fighting in a novel theatre, they might find that some pieces of equipment are either insufficient or missing, and as a result, an urgent operational requirement is raised and the process of procurement is expedited. COVID-19 certainly counted as such an emergency. Unlike the rest of Europe, who had previously bidded and bought their PPE stocks following the swine flu pandemic, UK supplies were woefully short. As a result, it was decided that the usual procurement process would be scrapped. Instead, ministers and government officials would be able to propose certain companies for contracts through a so-called VIP lane with, at the time, very little oversight. And this is where the problems began. Meet David Mellor. David Mellor owned Mellor Designs, a company producing fashion garments and clothing. Mellor Designs was awarded a £164 million contract in order to produce PPE during the pandemic. So far, this might not seem extraordinary, but Mellor Designs was recommended for the VIP lane by this man, Michael Gove. David Mellor and Michael Gove have something of a financial history. Mellor had previously made contributions to Michael Gove's Tory party leadership campaign and had also donated over £60,000 to the Conservative Party in general. So it would appear that David Mellor's contributions to the Tory party, and in particular to Michael Gove, had helped him to secure a £164 million contract from the government, funded, of course, by the British taxpayer. It's impossible to know for certain Michael Gove's intent in suggesting Mellor Designs for the contract, but it's easy to surmise that Gove likely would not have submitted the company were it not for his personal relationship with David Mellor. However, the case of Mellor Designs is insignificant compared to what comes next. Enter Ianda Capital. Now, if you thought that Ianda Capital sounded more like some kind of financial services related company rather than a textile manufacturer, you would be correct. Ianda Capital is a company registered in the tax haven of Mauritius, which specialises in currency trading, offshore property, private equity and trade financing. So knowing that Ianda Capital is a financial services company, you might be wondering just how they won a £250 million contract from the government in order to provide PPE for the NHS. The initial suggestion to give a contract to Ianda Capital was made by a man named Robert Mills. Now, Mills is a man of many talents. For example, he is a senior board advisor to Ianda Capital, a firm owned by his business associate, and at the time was also an advisor to the UK Board of Trade, headed by then Trade Secretary Liz Truss. Hyanda did fulfill their order by outsourcing production of the PPE to a factory in China. However, 50 million of the masks that they provided were unsuitable for use within the NHS. This resulted in over £150 million being wasted, as well as delays in getting suitable PPE to the NHS. There are too many examples of this kind of cronyism and in some cases stupidity to go into the details for every single one. For example, Stephen Parkin, founding executive chairman of Clipper Logistics, won the contract for hauling PPE to the NHS, and it just so happens that he has donated almost £1 million to the Conservative Party over the last few years. Public First, a PR firm headed by married couple James Frayne and Rachel Wolfe, was given an £840,000 contract to manage the PR around COVID-19 government messaging. The pair are also excellent friends of Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's chief advisor, and even once started a business with him previously. Naturally, this contract was never put out to any kind of tender. And then there's the case of Lux Lifestyle, a company with no assets, no employees and no turnover, yet somehow the choice for a £25 million contract to procure PPE for the NHS, which is almost as bad as the case of PestFix, a company with assets of just £18,000 and yet was awarded a £108 million contract for PPE procurement. Now, it's important to remember that whilst this is happening, PPE is actually being exported out of the UK and to other countries.
I don't understand why this pallet is going to Asteri in Fort Worth, Texas, and it's not going to a hospital in Manchester. I just don't understand.
I'm sure by now you're starting to get the picture. What's clear to me from these cases is that there was so much confusion and panic surrounding COVID-19 that many poor decisions were made, and some politicians and businessmen were able to capitalise, literally, on this and recommend friends and donors for lucrative contracts. This next example is, in my opinion, worse than all of the examples that have come before. In June of 2020, £200 million worth of contracts were awarded to a newly established company called PPE Medro. The name of this company almost reads like bait for the NHS. Later that year, the government published details of the contracts, as they're required to do under transparency laws. It was at this point that reporters began to notice the connections between PPE Medro and Baroness Mone. Baroness Mone is a member of the House of Lords and had previously built a business selling lingerie. This won her the nickname Baroness Bra, and she is also married to a man named Doug Barrowman. In December 2020, Mone and Barrowman communicate through a lawyer that they have no connection to PPE Medro whatsoever, and that to suggest anything else is defamatory. This, curiously, sounds like a threat of legal action against the reporters. Fast forward to November 2021, and as part of a Freedom of Information request, it's revealed that Baroness Mone did recommend PPE Medro for the VIP lane. However, because she does not stand to gain financially from the deal, she chose not to register it as one of her interests. A further Freedom of Information request, released in March 2022, revealed that Mone had offered to supply PPE through, quote, my team in Hong Kong. It now becomes clear that the relationship between PPE Medro, Mone and Barrowman is actually very strong, and in fact, 1 month later, the National Crime Agency raided Mone and Barrowman's home. It turns out that Barrowman was paid at least £65 million from PPE Medro's profits, which presumably is a large portion of it, and that £29 million of those profits was placed into a trust, of which Mone herself is a beneficiary. At present, the investigation into Mone and Barrowman's dealings is ongoing, and Mone has stepped down from the House of Lords temporarily. It doesn't seem difficult to imagine that Barrowman established PPE Medro during the pandemic in order to utilise his wife's connections, securing a government contract and capitalising on at least £65 million in profits.
But after everything, you can't see what you've done wrong when you've admitted today that you lied to the press, and by extension you lied to the public.
Laura, saying to the press I'm not involved to protect my family, can I just make this clear? It's not a crime. The press have got nothing to do with my family. I was protecting my family. And I think people will realise that in the press attacks that I have gone through since I walked into the House of Lords. I was a very successful individual businesswoman, and since I walked into the House of Lords, it's been a nightmare for my family. So that's not a crime to say to the press, to tell, the press what I did. That's not a crime.
Do you admit today that with the way that you've currently got your finances set up, that one day you and your children will benefit from that money, because you right now are listed as the beneficiaries of that trust.
If one day, if God forbid, my husband passes away before me, then I'm a beneficiary as well as his children and my children. So, yes, of course. I don't honestly see there's a case to answer. I can't see what we've done wrong. Doug and the consortium have simply delivered a contract, a delivery contract of goods.
Hello. Before I continue, if you enjoyed that kind of video, it's not the kind of video I usually make, the sort of animated explainer style, sort of slightly more edited video. If you enjoyed that, I'd really appreciate some kind of feedback. Subscriptions would be great if you're not already, but comments and likes. I mean, I reply to every comment anyway, but it will just give me some really good feedback, so I know that people sort of value that content. And it's not quite documentary style, it's probably a little bit too boring to be a documentary, but yeah, just any kind of feedback would be fantastic. What's left to conclude then? I could have made this video a lot longer. It could have been half an hour, probably could even have stretched to an hour, honestly, if I'd gone into the details of all of the individual cases. But I think if you go into all of that detail, you know, you start to lose people a little bit. But the detail's all there and you can go and look at it yourself. That's kind of why I included those rapid fire cases, so you can see that this problem's actually a lot bigger than just the cases that I went into in a little bit more detail. It's really quite disturbing that whilst we were being given these instructions to lock down, stay at home, protect the NHS, you know, clap on a Thursday or whatever it was, you know, whilst all of that was happening and people were making huge personal sacrifices, particularly the self-employed, incidentally, there were politicians and businessmen who were out there seeking to, I guess, use this catastrophe for profit. And I think that's really shameful. I think they really should be ashamed of themselves. Now, they'll probably tell you that they saw this as a call to action and that they were just trying to help the country. But it's just nonsense. That's just absolute nonsense. I don't believe a word of it, because if that was true, then you would have sacrificed the profits that you made. In the case of Baroness Moan, £60 million, or her husband made £60 million, and she obviously is not a beneficiary because her husband made all the money. Sure, you know, if you really were out there doing this not for profit but for the country, then that's another £60 million worth of PPE you could have bought and given to the NHS. Alternatively, you could give that £60 million back to the NHS. But the truth is, this was all business decisions motivated by greed. Who you knew made more impact on whether you won a contract rather than what you actually did or what your business did. I mean, Ironda Capital, like I said, it's a business centered around financial services, but they won a contract. But then there were businesses within the UK who literally build PPE who are having to sell it overseas. Absolutely monstrous. And I understand that the situation was obviously, it wasn't unprecedented because there's action plans in place for all of this stuff to take place. So this isn't the first pandemic. It's just one of the most serious ones we've encountered, or one of the most prolific ones we've encountered for many, many years. But, you know, all of this stuff, there is a plan in place, or at least there should be. I mean, it's preparedness, right? It's ensuring that the country's ready to face these challenges. But I understand that no doubt there was a lot of chaos when COVID hit. And you've got a lot of civil servants who, you know, aren't the sharpest tools in the box, some of them. Some of them will be very clever, I'm sure. There's some clever people in the civil service, okay? So if you're in the civil service, you're one of the clever ones, I'm sure. But look, there's a lot of people who are having to make some pretty frantic decisions. And I think a lot of times they were just sort of taken advantage of by some of the politicians and the businesses and the lobbying. I'll give you 50 grand here. And then, whoa, look, a £200 million contract lands towards my business. Honestly, it's unbelievable. And if you knew all of this before this video, I'd be very surprised, because I consider myself very, very interested in politics, particularly UK politics. And as I was going through all of these cases, I didn't realise the problem was as bad as it was, but it's really, really terrible. Anyway, that's it. There's nothing to be done now. There's ongoing cases. I would give a shout out to a group called the Good Law Project. So they brought to light a lot of this information about COVID in particular, and they're a sort of voluntary group of lawyers, and they get funding donated to them, etc., etc. And they're the ones who've been driving this through the courts. So fair play to them, shout out to them. That's where a lot of this information came from for this video. And that's it. I think, you know, I don't want to waffle too long because I've got a really bad habit of waffling too long. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, especially if you're still watching now that I've waffled for 5 minutes. And yeah, cheers. Right.